Now comes the ultimate challenge from Nintendo. The challenge of stopping World War III and becoming Top Gun.
I didn't have a NES growing up, like most people in the UK. We were entrenched in the delightful world of pretending we could do our homework on a microcomputer. That meant a lot of us skipped right past a load of Nintendo's original quality-filled classics such as Super Mario,
1, 2, and 3. There's power in numbers.
Contra,
See how far you can get in Super C.
or Metroid.
Defend the planet Cephas against the evil Mother Brain.
Unless you had a fancy friend or had managed to find one of the Nintendo arcade machines on holiday. The arcades, therefore, often became the milestone we all hoped for in terms of quality, something we often could only hope to emulate a sliver of on our home systems. Now, Nintendo had their fair share of arcade games, and those conversions often sat on the NES very well, if not perfectly, then generally always where it mattered in the gameplay. That all being said, it didn't really shift the British stance, because the level of quality didn't enter into the equation when you were given the choice of spending 50 quid on a game about a man jumping over barrels, or you could spend £6 to get exactly the same game on your ZX Spectrum. It's exactly the same. The human eye can't see more than 8 pixels at the same time. When compared to consoles at the time, games on microcomputers were essentially all budget titles, and 6 quid wasn't even the true budget price either. Often you'd find a half-decent bag of jank for 2 or 3 quid if you were lucky, which you usually weren't. Because when it did come to the wacky world of budget gaming, certainly for the ZX Spectrum, you were playing a metaphorical game of Russian roulette, only with 5 of the chambers filled with boredom bullets. So you had your 3 quid pocket money for the month, and it was time to pick from a delightful selection of games that looks absolutely banging on the cover, but could potentially end up being a war crime by the time you loaded the cassette. Would Mr. Wino really solve all of my problems as a child? Well, yes, actually. 2 quid's worth of yes. Drinking really is the solution to life's problems. This was the biggest benefit of the era, especially to parents who just wanted you to squirrel yourself out of the way for an afternoon, then get entertained, or annoyed or bemused for a day or two, until you almost inevitably begin to wonder why on earth they made every single game so needlessly difficult. You'd repeat this process over and over until something special would come along, something that grabbed your attention and didn't make you go outside into the filthy sunshine for once. You may not have been able to complete it or even understand what was going on, but there was something about sitting down and exploring a new world for a few seconds before dying and having to start all over again that really squeezed some life back into your childhood wonderland. And much like Killer Kong, which is exactly the same as Donkey Kong, we had a game on the ZX Spectrum that was exactly the same as Metroid, if Samus was a humanoid dragon who walked around like they just found their mother's high heels. It's exactly the same as Metroid.
It's survival or destruction. To battle or die. Metroid only from Nintendo.
Is it exactly the same as Metroid? No, I was lying. I was telling a massive fib to get you all excited, and now you're going to be hugely disappointed. But it doesn't matter, because the important thing is that I was the puppet master for 10 seconds. That's the power of YouTube. I've got you wrapped around my little finger. You are dancing in the palm of my hand. Lies aside, Draconis is very much inspired by Metroid, by which I mean it features a structured world that can be navigated as you see fit, in which you'll find items that unlock other areas or give you new powers that allow you to traverse the previously untraversable. Metroid was released on the NES in 1986, and Draconis landed on the C64 and ZX Spectrum in 1988. I therefore refuse to believe they weren't inspired by Samus's first outing. And if I'm wrong, well, that's just something we've all come to expect as a given. As with all budget titles, the artwork for the game is a sci-fi novelist's wet dream, and it also features things that aren't in the game because why not? These delightful hand lasers, for instance, are simply not a thing, and neither is this slimy rhinoceros that stands before our beloved hero. He's supposed to represent the final boss, but as you'll see later, it looks now like him. And before we move on from the cover art, what is this muscly dragon called? The protagonist with laser hands that you get to play through the game as? Smash Fist? Muscle Lord? Dragon Champ? Baron von Ripterfuck? No. Frognum. Frognum. I spent my entire life thinking this dude was called Draconis, and subsequently I also spent that time thinking he was a walking dragon man. He breathes fire out of his face, for fuck's sake, which is very actually like a dragon and very much actually not like a bloody frog. It turns out he's on the planet Draconis, and instead of being a scaly monstrous super beast, he's just a big frog whose parents were so unimaginative they named him after their own species. This is like my parents calling me Humanzo. He does actually get another name as well. At various points in the game you can turn into this giant fish beast, at which point you're no longer Frognum, you are Draconute, which is a far sexier name to give your lead character. Frognum. Unfortunately, you'll only spend about 10% of your time as Fish Spice, so enjoy being Frog Spice for most of your life. Your goal here is a simple one on paper. You're tasked with working out just where the hell it is you're supposed to go, what the hell you're supposed to do, and why on earth you're even doing it. The instructions state that you're there to obliterate the tyrant beast who, let's be clear, hasn't even given his side of the argument yet. I mean, sure, give them a name like Tyrant Beast and anyone can sound bad, but he may well just be misunderstood. We don't know his backstory. All we know is that he hangs around with piranhas and insects and mole things, but that's basically what Steve Irwin did, and he was a very nice man. But regardless, that's what the instructions say, so that's what you're going to be doing. Murdering someone for reasons. The controls take a little getting used to, with the standard up, down, left and right coupled with a single fire button, but with multiple moves assigned to all of this. Ducking down, for instance, requires a single tap, otherwise you just start doing squats. Hot, sexy frog squats. Holding fire and pressing down breathes fire in a crouch position. Holding fire and up does a stand-up fire attack, and holding fire while pressing left or right will make Frognum punch. You may wonder why you bother punching if you've got the ability to breathe fire, but you'd be a fool for thinking they wouldn't limit the one cool thing you can do as a frog. A fool, I say! From the off, you'll have a few directions you can go in, and your first few attempts at playing the game are no doubt going to result in you walking off the edge of a platform, falling for an hour, and then dying, in the most heavy metal way possible. I mean, seriously, this death animation is incredible. Poor lad just snaps in half. Is this standard frog behaviour? A frog's perforated like toilet paper. It doesn't matter, it's excellent. More snapping in half when we die in games, please. It's the most rewarding way to die. Once you get a feel for the place, map out potential areas you can go and work out where the treasure lies, and probably more importantly what that treasure actually does, because some of them aren't exactly explicit, but we'll come back to that. You'll begin to map out your journey either on paper, like a massive nerd, or in your head, like a cool guy. On said journey, you'll face plenty of enemies that you need to smash up, and it's here where some of Draconis' problems start to crop up. The feel of combat is squishy. At best. You're never quite sure if you're hitting enemies or even if they're hitting you, owing to a life bar that sometimes decreases and sometimes just doesn't. Likely due to it only updating at specific integers. It doesn't exactly offer immediate feedback, and when half of the enemies you fight require you to stand right up in their hitbox and punch, it's not a system that feels particularly fair. And it gets worse. Some screens, for instance, will have you appear right on top of enemies with absolutely no way to know that they're there until you're already being battered by them. Equally, some enemies are invulnerable, but with nothing to differentiate them from normal enemies. You just have to learn through trial and error what is and what isn't allergic to frog punches. There are also certain screens where, should you wait around for too long, the enemies just go absolutely ballistic and home in on you like a randy magnet. To summarise, there's a lot of trial and error here, and if the game had a tighter combat system that felt a little more impactful than waving your paper fist at random bubbles, it maybe wouldn't feel quite so punishing. But I also feel like this trial and error is somewhat baked into the game plan. It feels mean, but it also feels intentional, and that's down to a few things that probably sound incredibly basic, but feels rather generous compared to most ZX Spectrum games at the time. For one, the enemies don't respawn, meaning you can clear out screens for easy passage later on, and two, there are respawn points. Respawn points that admittedly don't get used an awful lot thanks to the cruel amount of lives you begin with, but these two things hand in hand lead me to believe that the developers wanted you to get out there and explore this place, make errors, take note of those errors, and slowly map out the game space in your head. It's an archaic design, sure, but it's a design. It's already a step up from most budget Spectrum titles. So the Metroid comparison. To fully explore this place and reach the poor sod who needs to have his head caved in, you're going to need items. The first item you'll find allows you to transform into your better named counterpart, Fishy Biscuits, giving you access to these areas of the map. You can only turn into an Olympic swimmer by standing on this particular pad and pushing down, pushing down. There we go. This thing is a little odd because really it should work anywhere on the pad, but it only seems to work on the far left of the pad, and it hilariously meant that the game got absolutely slated by Your Sinclair because they couldn't work that out. Bear in mind, Crash gave this 90% and Sinclair User gave it 94%, but Your Sinclair went off in a huff with 3 out of 10. Dragonus would have been great, except for one hiccup in the gameplay's implementation. There are 2 characters, one of which can only be brought into play once you have a particular object in your pocket, and the main character is standing in a special slab. It doesn't work! Shame really, as it could have been quite good if you could complete it. Yes, they do call the game Dragonus throughout the review, including in the header of the review. This feels like it was reviewed by someone who woke up in the morning and realised he had 10 minutes before publication. But to give them their due, it is a bit of a weird issue that probably just shouldn't have been there. Other items you pick up include this one that only gives you a vague indication of what it does, and it took me a long old while to work out just what on earth this meant. It removes this wall. Why does it remove this wall? Because. The final item I found allowed me to shoot a weird projectile when in the air, which, to clarify, means you have to quickly press up, then fire, and make sure you're not still pressing fire when you land, otherwise you'll waste some of your limited fire breath. Not exactly intuitive, but it'll have to do. From there, really, you're just left with working out how to reach the final boss, and it's a bit of a convoluted maze to get there, with plenty of death lying in wait to stop you from reaching the end screen. This is a ZX Spectrum game after all. The final run to the boss room is absolutely littered with enemies designed to kill you off, or at best reduce your energy down to a sliver. But when you do reach that final boss, at the very least, it's impressive looking. That is to say, it's impressive looking, but it doesn't really do an awful lot, and neither do you. This is how you fight the final boss. So Draconus then, or Dragonus if you're late for work, it's a game that offered quite a bit of value for its measly price range, and it's one of the only games I can think of that actively tried to ape the Metroid formula on the ZX Spectrum, and it did so without ripping it off wholesale, which, let's be honest, fairly common tactic back in the 80s. There are plenty of things to dislike about the game, sure, it's not exactly a bona fide classic that you need to rush out and play immediately, but it stands as something that impressed me back when it released, having no knowledge of Metroid at all, and it still impresses me now with its relatively well-conceived concept. Could it have been better? Yes, but for £3 I got a game that was exactly the same as Metroid, and Metroid cost the same price as a mortgage down payment. So step aside, Samus. My heart belongs to Frognum. Frognum?